Mark Simpkin, ABC News, Canberra.
Time to discuss some of the issues behind the numbers. We're joined by the Program Director of Economics at the Centre for Independent Studies, Simon Cowan, and the Executive Director of the Australia Institute, Richard Dennis. Simon and Richard, thank you for being with us tonight. Simon, I might start with you.
Sure.
You put in a submission for the...
We did indeed.
For the COA, as they call it now. You must be pretty happy with those recommendations, given that so many of the ones that you suggested were included in the report.
Indeed. Look, I think they've taken our recommendations quite seriously, which is a good thing, and they've taken some steps towards changing the relationship that Australians have with their government. And I think that is the key element that we really need to address if we want to confront our future fiscal challenges. We've got a lot of middle-class welfare in Australia. We aren't at the level that they're at in Europe, but there are things that we can do more efficiently and better, and that's what we need to do to try and get the budget back into the black in the short term and prepare for our ageing population in the long term.
If I could just pick up on that relationship with the government, you mentioned earlier today the government must have the courage to convince the public of the need. Now, why do you call that courage? Obviously, there's cuts and changes to people's lives across the board. What kind of courage is it going to take for this government to convince the public?
Well, quite frankly, the Commission of Audit has done a good job of identifying areas of potential savings. It is now up to the politicians to say, these are the savings that we're going to take on and this is why. And to date, there's been a lot of confused messages about, whether we've got a short-term budget emergency, whether we've got a problem with debt and deficit. And what I think government really needs to do is say, in the longer term, we cannot sustain the level of spending we have now, and we need to address that. And that's the conversation they have to start, and that's a conversation that's going to take courage, because people don't want to hear that their benefits are being cut.
Richard Dennis. We can't afford business as usual, seems to be the bottom line here.
Well, we can afford business as usual for all the support we give to business. We can afford business as usual for the incredibly generous tax concessions we give for superannuation. We can afford business as usual for the diesel fuel rebate. I mean, this is a Commission of Audit by big business for big business. I mean, the head of the business councils run it, the head of policy for the business councils come up with the ideas, and strangely enough, they've come up with the idea that we should cut welfare payments, cut health, cut education. According to Treasury, Australia doesn't have a spending problem, it has a revenue problem. If John Howard was trying to live on the current level of revenue we have, John Howard would have been in deficit for 10 of the 12 years he was Prime Minister. At 23% of GDP, this is a level of revenue. So we can imagine we've got a spending crisis. We can scare people and say, we can't keep spending like this. Well, we can keep spending like this if we collected the revenue we used to. Revenue's collapsed, and this Commission of Audit ignored that. Picking
up on something that Richard Dennis says there, Simon, about this being by big business for big business, in effect, this report. At one point, Tony Shepherd, the chair of this commission, said today, specifically about the public service sector jobs that may well go, he said that they should perhaps be thinking not so much in terms of their jobs, but for the country, in terms of the country. This from a company boss, from the former head of the Australian Council of Business. How often do company bosses think not of the country, but of corporate profits and of shareholders?
Well, that's their job, though. If you are running a company, your job is to run the company for the shareholders, and it's the job of the government to look after the country. It's the job of taxpayers and voters to determine what sort of government they want. It's not up to corporate leaders to make those sort of changes. Now, I think if you talk about what's happening for big business in this, one of the key areas of cuts that we identified, and the Commission did as well, was corporate welfare. Government handouts to big business, and the Commission of Audit says that we should slash them drastically. 22 programs of corporate assistance will be cut down, including areas of research and development that should be taken on by private enterprise.
I'd like to move the discussion a little bit broadly, picking up on something you mentioned there, Richard, about the 23% GDP. The United States, obviously different countries, different fiscal issues, some countries in recession. The United States, at about 90% of their GDP is basically borrowed. Most of their money is borrowed, one of the strongest economies in the world. We're looking at Germany, about 80% GDP, and renowned to be fiscally quite conservative. Why is it so important to have low debt? I apologise for the quite simple question, but why is it important to sell that message?
It's a very good question. Someone who earned $100,000 a year who bought a $500,000 house would have a debt-to-income ratio of 500%. Okay, Australian households borrow huge amounts of money. Businesses, when they're expanding, mining companies in particular, borrow huge amounts of money to expand. Australia has a debt-to-GDP ratio of around 23%. Right? By historic standards, this is very low. By international standards, this is very low. And we hear these silly analogies, or you couldn't run a household like that. Well, actually, yes, you absolutely could, and we do. Or you couldn't run a business like that. Again, yes, we do. So, look, it's a great question. Why, given that we're one of the lowest debt countries in the world, given that our debt is low by historic standards, a bit higher than it was 5 years ago, a lot lower than it was 50 years ago, why should it be lower? Good question. Why aren't we borrowing to invest in the infrastructure that a rapidly growing population needs? We've got hundreds of thousands of people a year moving to Australia. There's no room on the trains, there's no room in the hospitals. And we've got people saying, well, we can't borrow any money. We're a very low debt country.
There's several reasons why we should be concerned about debt, and I'm happy to accept that at the moment Australia has a relatively low level of debt. It has increased rapidly. But you have to remember that debt is an intergenerational transfer. We are borrowing money today, not to invest in infrastructure and productive enterprise and assets for the future. We are borrowing money today to invest in consumption today. The majority of the increase in spending in government has come on short-term programs, they've come on consumable programs, they've come on recurrent expenditure, not on investment in infrastructure. And that is why it is unsustainable. We are borrowing money from future generations who will have to pay it back, who are already subject to $12 billion a year in interest and will be subject to more. We are borrowing from the future to pay for our consumption. And it seems reasonable to me, at least, to say if we're going to consume this, we should pay for it. And that's what the Commission of Audit is saying.
Again, Simon, today Tony Shepherd said the Commission recognises the unfairness of saddling today's children with our debts. In effect, what you were just saying. But for so many of the young, as they look at this and say, OK, you're looking to the future, but for us, how do we get to the future if we have to pay more for something as simple that your generation got virtually for free, such as university education? You are now proposing that we have to pay 55% to better ourselves.
Indeed, and that is it's a very important point, and it's one of the reasons why people feel that some of this stuff is unfair, because we have
Do you think it's unfair?
No, I think that people who can afford to pay for the services themselves should be paying for them themselves. And I think that should have been true in Australia for some time, and it hasn't been. We have been living on borrowed money. We have expanded particularly entitlements for the middle class in areas like family tax benefits, where we should that government should never have been spending that money, and it's right they should stop spending it now.
Richard, what happens to a country looking at a generation? We're looking at 11 years or so until there's this supposed surplus, which there's questions around how important a surplus is. Let's put that aside. A generation of children growing up, a generation too of potentially young children who can't get a job in their local area, who are forced to move to get a job somewhere else, all that entails. Does that provide a generation which is focused towards the future and which builds a country to a place where we want it to be?
No, it's the exact opposite of that. You only get one chance to educate a child. You can't put it off. You only get one chance to treat someone when they're very sick. You can't put it off. And this idea that we're saddling future generations with this burden of debt, well, you know what? I'm driving around on roads that someone paid for 30 years ago. I'm benefiting today from their debt. Okay, I'm going to hospitals that someone borrowed 30 years ago to build. Previous generations did me a favour by borrowing money to invest in the services that I need and that I use, and I pay for it out of my tax. And this idea that it's all borrowed money, it's just absolute nonsense. The federal government spends around $350 billion a year, and we've got a deficit at the moment in a slow economy post-GFC of around $50 billion a year. The vast majority of the money the government spends today is money the government collected today. Some of it is being spent on infrastructure. We're buying fighter planes that I'm told we'll have for 40 years. We are building infrastructure today with that money. So this idea that we're burdening future generations, the burden is not educating them. The burden is not treating them when they're sick. The burden is not giving them the roads and the trains they need to get to school.
In your submission, Simon Cowan, as part of the push for smaller government, you recommended the federal departments of health, of education, of agriculture be closed. What do you think about getting rid of some of the associated federal MPs as well, making some of the electorates a bit bigger, getting rid of some of these MPs? We won't need Barnaby Joyce as the Minister for Agriculture. We won't need Dutton as the Minister for Health. Let's shrink that as well. What do you think?
Well, Barnaby Joyce actually wrote quite a scathing piece on our recommendation to close down the Department of Agriculture. But it is important to remember what we're talking about here is services and functions that have always been carried out by the state governments, that remain the responsibility of the state governments, that are now being regulated at the federal level as well as at the state level. And health and education are perfect examples. The Federal Department of Education has over 1,000 people, and yet they have no teachers. They have no direct responsibility for schools. What they do is they exist to provide funding to schools, which is again a state government responsibility, and provide additional oversight on top of the state government authorities. And one of the things the Commission pointed out, quite rightly, is that if this is a state government responsibility, if it's regulated at the state government level, why do you need the federal government to regulate it as well? And the answer is that you don't.
We could discuss...
Did you write a reply?
Oh, look, I think if we can find waste and duplication, we should get rid of it, absolutely. But the idea that I, as a citizen of Australia, am entirely unconcerned about education in Tasmania, where we know educational levels are incredibly low by national standards, that I, as a citizen of Australia, am entirely unconcerned about appalling health outcomes for Indigenous people in the Northern Territory. Unfortunately, some of our states drop the ball on these issues, and I am actually a citizen of Australia, and the Commonwealth Government has tried over the years to influence what the states do. So waste and duplication, agreed, get rid of it. But a lot of the purpose of the Commonwealth Public Service is to try to make sure that no matter where you live in Australia, you get access to the services that we can afford to provide.
We could discuss this all evening, I think. Thank you so much to you, Richard Dennis, and Simon Cowan for dropping in tonight. Thank you.
Thanks very much, gentlemen. Well, as we've just been discussing, if all